Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Natália Mello. I am a lecturer of International Relations Studies at PUC-SP, and it's a great pleasure for us at PUC and a great honor for me to introduce our speaker today, Professor Inderjeet Parmar, who is going to give us a lecture entitled Killer Knowledge for Combat: How American Liberal-Imperial Power Works in an Age of Knowledge Network Warfare. This event was organized by a research group called Grupo de Estudos sobre Conflitos Internacionais, GECI, chaired by Reginaldo Narce. Our today's webinar is part of a research project on American elites and global hegemony, which we have been conducting since last year with funding of PPEC at PUC. In addition, I must also acknowledge that this event was organized in partnership with the Centro de Estudos de Cultura Contemporânea, SEDEC, and the Instituto para Estudos de Estados Unidos, INCT-INEU. Parmar will deliver his lecture for around 1 hour long, and after that we will have a question and answer session. So I will ask for the members of the audience, if you want to ask a question, please use the YouTube chat. So I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Inderjeet Parmar, who is professor at the City University of London and currently is a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Parmar was past president of the British International Studies Association and is co-editor of a book series called Routledge Studies in U.S. Foreign Policy. He is the author and co-author of numerous books and articles on American foreign policy elites, special studies on philanthropic foundations, think tanks, state agencies, and so on. His last book is titled Foundations of the American Century: Ford, Carnegie, and Rockefeller Foundations in the Rise of American Power, published by Columbia University Press. Professor Parmar, we are really glad to have you with us today. Your books and presentations are tremendously inspiring, and I always recommend it to my students because it helps to reveal how refined the American hegemonic power is and how it has a flexible ability to reshape itself. So, in the name of everyone following our session today, I would like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Please be welcome to our webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalia. It's very kind of you, and it is a privilege for me to be asked to deliver this lecture on a subject which is very close to my work and my life, actually, since maybe the 1980s or so. And it's something which I'm very pleased to accept your kind invitation, because it gave me a chance to add to my knowledge with more recent developments, which I had lost a little bit of touch with since the book Foundations came out a few years, 10 years ago now. And it allows me to also see how complex the politics of knowledge and the politics of the world appears to have become in that past 10 to 11 years as well, and how the crisis of liberal order, which I think we all knew in various ways, has a long history. It has become more and more acute. And I think the role of knowledge in that, understanding that kind of character of that crisis, I think continues to be very important. Now, the lecture title I deliberately chose as quite provocative, Killer Knowledge for Combat, because I wanted to leave in no one's mind any doubt that knowledge is not something, when I'm talking about knowledge here, and the production and dissemination, crystallization and mobilization of knowledge, I'm not talking about knowledge as something we do sitting in a library in an armchair and so on, but is knowledge produced for use, and it is used for violence and for warfare. And that is to say, it is very far from the concept of soft power, which we often associate with culture, knowledge, and the academy, or think tanks and so on. So I wanted to leave no doubt, especially in the context of the Russian aggression in Ukraine and everything that's happened before and since then, that knowledge for warfare is fundamental to American power itself. And so I wanted to make sure that anyone who saw that title would be left in no doubt that this is knowledge for war, knowledge for violence, knowledge for killing. And I'll explore that theme properly in the rest of this talk as well. So what we can say is that the Russian war on Ukraine has unleashed some powerful forces in world politics, highlighted the changing contours of world power and the numerous simultaneously interacting factors and forces at play today. That is to say, we have been in crises before, and we will be again, but it seems to me that the number of crises going on simultaneously and in an interconnected way has complexified world politics, and the Russian war has in effect kind of compounded that and made more acute that kind of understanding and sense of crisis. This war in Europe reflects what I would argue is a broader set of recent ongoing wars and military conflict around the world. It is not unique. So we have Yemen and Palestine, we have Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria. There's military violence and action by France and other powers in Western Africa and many other places as well. But I would argue that this war does have some features that distinguish it from the point of view of this lecture topic, that knowledge production and mobilization regarding American hegemony, that this war features information and knowledge warfare by states which have a highly developed, long-standing set of elite knowledge networks, and which are in many respects intertwined and interpenetrated with each other. That these states which are waging this war at the moment are economically, financially, and in terms of elite knowledge networks, intertwined with each other. And that's become even more acute, particularly since the end of the Cold War. On the other hand, there are also significant knowledges and knowledge networks that are located outside the metropolitan core countries, or that are critical of the core states, but are from within the core states themselves. And I would argue that there are two large-scale historical factors for change at work at this time. At home in the core liberal order states, there is a long-term development of post-colonial, decolonial academic thought, particularly in international relations discipline, which has combined with worldwide mass protests sparked by the police killing of, among others, George Floyd in the United States in 2020, which has produced a combined academic and political movement which has boosted the struggle to decolonize Western societies. That is a huge new factor in the world, or two factors which have combined in the world, the academic and the political. The second major factor which is at work, which is really important for us, for me, in what I'm saying today, is that there is a greater redistribution of global power. There are emerging states and political and knowledge economies that are competing on the world stage, which are vying for status and position, who are no longer so reliant on Western knowledge and ideas, and which are fueled by their own interests and strong, fresh memories of colonial era violence and exploitation, of neo-colonial violence and exploitation, and other military and other interventions since then and into the 21st century. And the global inequalities highlighted by vaccine nationalism and the pandemic, and the intellectual property rights which are clung on to so tightly by big Western pharmaceutical companies, and the inadequacies of the EU and the World Health Organization and other international liberal core order bodies have shown once again that there are a massive schism between the global South, however well it is doing, and the global North. And that is a major factor, that there is a level, if you like, of global resentment, a greater level of recognition about this inequality, and I think a greater assertiveness among global South leaders, states, however big or small, who are becoming more assertive in the world, that they have to fight for those positions. So those two factors, the domestic academic shifts, post-colonial, decolonial, as well as the movements worldwide against police violence, racist police violence, combined with the changes in the contours of the distribution of global power, have created a very, very powerful position of contestation of liberal core order knowledge and knowledge networks. However, those forces which I've just mentioned, domestically and globally, remain relatively marginal in many ways, in varying levels, and this is demonstrated by the current war crisis in Ukraine, especially at the domestic levels in the core EU states, for example, and in the United States, with an information and knowledge wars in full swing and a mass mobilization of knowledge for war. Nevertheless, these dissenting voices are there. They are audible and visible, much more than they have ever been. They are under pressure, but they are making themselves heard as well. There is political, diplomatic, economic, and ideational resistance, and an offering of alternative ways of thinking and acting in the world, so that the crisis of the liberal international order and of US hegemony is therefore reflected in the current politics of the Ukraine war. All wars are also information, propaganda, and knowledge wars to shape the narrative, define the problems and causes, legitimize the strategies and the goals. And the current war shows us in full technicolor American and Western power remains a mighty force in practically every respect in the world today, militarily, economically, systemically, financially, diplomatically, in terms of media mobilizations, knowledge mobilizations in academia, among think tanks and foundation networks as well. Yet, despite all of these great powers, which we must recognize, there is still a crisis right at the heart of the liberal international order and the knowledge which underpins that particular order. So what I would like to do today in this lecture is to do three things. First, I'd like to look at how knowledge and American political development, wars and imperial expansion are intimately connected. I want to sort of talk about the importance of elite knowledge networks in that as well. The second thing I'd like to do is look at a number of competing theories, very briefly, theories of knowledge and knowledge elites' roles in American liberal democracy, and also offer a distillation of a rereading of Gramscian theory that includes consideration of hierarchies in addition to class. In addition to class, that is to say, race, gender, linguistic, geographical, colonial core, and north and south. Of course, time is short and I can't go into it in any depth, but I will try to offer something along those kind of lines. So that's the second thing I'd like to do, is a kind of theoretical element, because the findings we have theoretical implications for how to understand how the world works and how American power particularly works. And the third thing I'd like to do is to look at the think tanks, foundations, and universities' roles in the Ukraine war. That is to say, to look at elite knowledge networks at war. And in that regard, I'm going to look at a kind of sprinkling of institutions. The Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Rand Corporation, the Ukraine Information Lobby in the United States, the Atlantic Council, very briefly, the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as the mobilizations within the mass media and mainstream media within the United States and elsewhere as well. And then I will move on to some conclusions. So first things first then, to look at how knowledge and American political development, wars and imperial expansion are intimately connected. I just want to start with a few quotations to give a flavor from within these institutions, these elite knowledge networks, which gives an idea about how they see knowledge and what role knowledge plays. So the first one is a quote from the Rockefeller Foundation from the 1930s. And the quote is, "Put knowledge to work." The second one is from the Rockefeller Foundation, again, from the Second World War. And this quote is to the effect, "Social science is as essential to the US role in world affairs as gun sights are to waging warfare." That is knowledge for war. The third one is from the Yale Institute of International Studies, which received a very large amount of US Foundation funding and other as well. The Yale Institute of International Studies was formed in 1935, and they came with the concept in 1941-42 of permanent warfare, that the nature of American power in the post-World War II period would be one in which there would be permanent warfare because problems for America start far from its shores. The fourth quote is from Samuel Huntington, where he argues, quote, "Whatever there is of an American empire was acquired by intellectual penetration rather than territorial acquisition." And that tells us a great deal about the importance of knowledge and how we should not see it wholly, even mainly in soft power terms. The fifth I'd like to read to you is about Robert Lind. Robert Lind was a Columbia University sociologist back in the 1930s and 1940s. And in 1940, he put forward a proposal, a research proposal, which was an anti-fascist, pro-democratic research proposal to the big foundations, which was to put forward a way of fighting against fascism in the United States without succumbing to xenophobia, anti-German kind of racism and so on, and maintaining civil liberties and democratic rights in the process of fighting against fascism during the period of the Second World War. This was rejected. It was rejected because, according to Rockefeller and Carnegie and others who looked at this proposal, they argued that Lind didn't understand something very fundamental about the world, that the world was at war, and the point of war and knowledge in war was to train people to kill people. That was the point of knowledge production at that time. And this idea about defending democracy in the fight against fascism was completely and utterly beyond the pale for those foundations to fund. And they rejected what was a very good and interesting proposal at that time. The last one I would like to read is much more recent. It's from the Carnegie Corporations of New York 2014 annual report, which I came across in preparation for this particular lecture. And this is a comment in relation to a grant being awarded in around 2014, 2015, which said, "The aim of this grant," unquote, "is to help scholars choose the right types of problems to work on, to shift the intellectual climate and push back against the cult of irrelevance that dominates the social sciences." So what we have here, if you like, is an entire mentality backed up with very large financial power over many decades. And now we are into the second century of these elite knowledge networks, which see the world in particular ways, America in particular ways, and they see the role of knowledge and knowledge production and mobilization in particular ways. Knowledge is to shift the patterns of power, and the distribution of power towards American elites and away from others, using violent knowledge as required, and furnishing institutions and proliferating institutions and networks which would enable them to do that. And that, in effect, in what they were really talking about was the construction of elite knowledge networks as an end in itself, because once elite knowledge networks with all their different hubs and nodes are constructed, they begin to have a life of their own, and they have a much wider kind of ramifications and intellectual and political and mental consequences as well. And we can see how in the United States, this trend and tendency, this recognition or the discovery of the knowledge network as the core of hegemonic projects and the core of hegemony itself, and therefore in need of constant nurturing, developing, financing, extending, promoting, and so on, that this was a core discovery, if you like, of how hegemony actually can be promoted, operationalized, and consolidated. And that this occurred in the United States, but it also occurred almost simultaneously at an international level as well. And we can see that right over the American century. We go back to the beginning of the 20th century, 100 years ago or more, we can see the recognition and the kind of scientific way in which knowledge and knowledge deployment, knowledge construction and knowledge mobilization was seen as to strategically shift the distribution of power in favor of elites, East Coast elites in particular, and away from others, both within the United States as well as outside of the United States. And then when the time came in different periods of history, particularly after the Second World War and into the Cold War, we see the extension of the elite knowledge network technology, the power technology, to other countries, strategic states, strategic regions, and the building of elite knowledge networks within those which are fully integrated into global North American, European, and other global networks as well, and up to and including the integration into those knowledge networks in very powerful ways of the BRIC powers too. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many other countries which are in the kind of more middle elements of world power too. So what we have in effect, and Ukraine and Central Europe, to mention it in that regard, so that what we have is these kind of the globalization of these knowledge networks and the kind of headquartering of those networks in global North locations and the reproduction of global North serving elite mentalities to a wider range of regions and states and societies around the world. And we can see, therefore, that it makes logical sense that this is what they do, because knowledge institutions developed in the United States from the late 19th century, like foundations and so on, alongside and in relation to the development of social sciences themselves, in lockstep with other major material changes inside the United States and globally. So inside the United States, massive industrial change, massive immigration from abroad and migration within, as well as population increases, urbanization and increased complexities in society and economy, but also globally, a scramble for Africa had begun in the 1880s and 1890s, the closing of the American frontier, the virtual extermination of Native Americans, the globalization of America's imperial ambitions to join the colonial club, but with new concepts, new knowledge, new ideas, new ways of control, new concepts of control via internationalist ideology and against colonial territorial acquisition and redivision. And so what I would argue is then that the knowledge network, knowledge as power technology, is fundamental to American hegemony. It's fundamental, in effect, to kind of bring together and unify all the different elements of American power through the conceptualization and the intellectual work to develop concepts of power, which are then economic and military and other, or rationalized economic, military, and other kinds of powers. So just to quote another Ford Foundation official, Jeffrey Puryear, to this effect, he argued, quote, sustained investment in creating a stock of talented social scientists can qualitatively change a country's political culture and its political technocracy. And we see the actual impacts of this, particularly in the last 100 years, but in the grand area conceptualizations in the Second World War by the work of the Council on Foreign Relations and the 100 scholars they assembled to develop post-war American global strategy, the mobilization of 100 knowledge makers from around the academy and from other elements of practitioners in diplomacy and so on, who sat for many years, funded by the big foundations and also by the American state as well, to remake world order and to place America right at the heart of it in the post-World War II phase. So what I would argue is that war and crisis are midwives of change and the midwives of new strategic concepts. And we can go back 100 years or more and we can find the way in which World War I and the Russian Revolution led to the development of concepts such as liberal internationalism, a whole theory of how to reorder the world and to set up international institutions and so on. How the Great Depression and World War II and the emergence of Anglo-American cooperation also created new concepts for a new world order, and how war, particularly the attack by the Japanese militarists on Pearl Harbor in 1941, acted as a catalyst for whole new ways of thinking. The 1949 Chinese Revolution and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 were a massive spur to the formation of Asian studies as a coherent area studies discipline. The Cuban Revolution and the rise of Latin American studies as a way of kind of trying to defuse the tensions within Latin American societies, often led by big foundations, but also by the US Army and the connections between those kinds of institutions as well. How in the 1970s, the demands from the global south, or the third world as it was known then, and the G77 for a new international economic order, a new concept for world organization and world institutions and redistributions of power in the 1970s, led directly to a kind of grotesque transmutation of that demand for the new international economic order in what was a kind of much more integrated system of BRICS, including China's integration into the capitalist world economy. How after the Cold War end, democratic peace theory and democracy promotion replace Cold War containment concepts at the so-called end of history. How 9/11 also acted as a spur for neoconservative driven thinking and the war on terror that followed. How the Iraqi surge policy in 2006 was promoted by the American Enterprise Institute itself. And then, of course, we can look more immediately at the kind of things that we've been talking about, or we want to talk about it more later on, that the Russian war in Georgia and Ossetia in 2008, and then later 2014, and now in 2022, also lead to knowledge shifts, new initiatives, kind of new ways of thinking and understanding, and a promotion of new institutions, new programs, or the kind of resuscitation of old programs, some of which had gone into abeyance as a result of the end of the Cold War and so on. And I will look at a little bit more in the third section of my talk. So the first thing, if you like, what I wanted to kind of look at was the way in which, if you like, war and crisis and knowledge are intimately related in the way in which American power has developed, grown up, has become globalized, and the world, if you like, and America is thick with elite knowledge networks, dense with institutions at the national and international and global levels as well. And that is a very, very great power. It is when crises break out, like the Ukraine crisis, is when you see that what are kind of, if you like, can be relatively unheard voices for a while, although they're always working in the background, suddenly are ready for combat. That when the crisis breaks and they are needed, they are there, right there, front, left, and center, in front of the television, worldwide. And they are the people who are giving their opinions about everything and backing up the strategies of the states, which are involved as well, and thereby giving that intellectual legitimacy of expertise at prestigious institutions, which are very well known and respected and so on, and which then, if you like, enter that feedback loop between policymakers, the media, and these intellectuals and so on, and have a massive effect on the kind of attentive public, as well as the wider ranges of the public as well. And so these are integrated into the American hegemonic project. The second thing, as I said, I would like to do is to look at a number of competing theories, because how to explain all this, there is contestation on that front too. There is no agreed widespread or sort of totally dominant monopoly of knowledge on how to explain knowledge power. And so what is interesting is that more and more is knowledge power recognized as a key force, as a key power, and that its role in the American foreign policy establishment is more widely recognized than it used to be. So, for example, in the book among others, called The Hell of Good Intentions by Stephen Walt, he talks about the foreign policy elite, or the blob, or the American foreign policy establishment. And he sees it as a kind of almost permanent power, which is located in universities, in think tanks, in research institutes, in government agencies, and so on, and funded by a whole range of groupings from a range of sources, particularly so-called philanthropic, or what I would call corporate foundations. And his argument is that this is a kind of element of pluralism within the American polity. But this pluralism is so deep, this group is so deeply entrenched that it almost has, if you like, a kind of permanent sort of power. But he does not see it as a kind of cohesive, elite-wide, large-scale, and so on, enough to critique his idea about American society and its so-called liberalism and democratic character and so on. But he does recognize how powerful that grouping, those sets of groupings and those networks are. But he doesn't know how to make sense of it. And in fact, in realist theory, this group ought not really to have very much of a say at all, because it is state policymakers and the security dilemma and the anarchic international system that they interpret and so on, which are supposed to be calling the shots. Here he's giving power to a group which is be outside of the state, even if it's integrated to some elements of it. And I think he undermines the kind of realist perspective. But what it does do, it recognizes the power of knowledge technology, knowledge as power technology itself. Then there's also the kind of broad, loose, liberal theory of the free market of ideas, a la about 1916 Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who talks about the free trade in ideas as a kind of core right within the United States, but taken up by many other liberals also, of course, and who argue that actually the United States isn't a sort of, there isn't a monopoly of knowledge inside the United States, dominated by the ruling class or ruling elites or the power elite or whatever, but there's a free market of ideas in which there's intense competition, that different ideas vie for status, power, influence, and the best ideas win out. And that we know, I think, is completely, is very much a kind of very flawed idea empirically, at the very least. Yet the realists and the liberals, like Tony Smith, for example, who talks about liberal hubris, and where Walt talks about the hell of good intentions, again, well-intended, America as a good state, a good force in the world, trying to do good, but actually very flawed in various kinds of ways, and in Smith's terms, hubristic, arrogant, trying to force democracy on other people. Good things like democracy on other people, they're not ready for it. They don't want it. They don't understand it. And they'll be ready someday, but they're not ready now, and you can't do it like this. That is to say, both realists and liberals share this common view that actually America is a good state, overambitious, gets carried away, but in the end trying to do good. But the road to hell can be paved with good intentions as well. Third, there is this kind of variation of those two, which is democratic elite theory. And democratic elitism basically suggests the sort of superiority of expertise, or what Walter Lippmann called the secular priesthood. This is a technocratic knowledge elite, which is above politics and the state, above business and ideology, including Americanism, and which, if you like, is absolutely foundational and necessary in modern complex America and modern complex states and societies, where you need technical knowledge and a lot of other kinds of wisdom, which only comes from expertise in the social sciences, the political sciences, and so on, which the masses of ordinary people do not have. They are apathetic, they are disinterested, they can't really be trusted to come up with real knowledge which can be of any good, any use. The mob mentality is juxtaposed against the elite science and expertise. And this mentality of looking down on the American people themselves is racialized within America, but also racialized and hierarchical abroad. Black and brown bodies are numerous and they are expendable. And in this kind of vision of how America ought to be, there is no, if you like, accounting for how this technocratic elite, this secular priesthood, how it exercises its power and who pays the price of the exercise of that power, particularly when it becomes violent. But as you know, I favor a Gramscian perspective, and Gramsci's sort of idea about knowledge power is that knowledge power is a fundamental part of hegemony, but that hegemony is laced with violence. It is not soft power as Joseph Nye understands it, but it is lethal in its operations and its effects. For example, in my book, Foundations of the American Century, I looked in great depth at a number of different cases, particularly Indonesia and Chile, to show how lethal so-called soft power actually was. It led to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people being locked up, tortured, imprisoned, and in Indonesia's case, many millions of lives being lost in a virtual bloodbath in the mid-1960s, assisted by various forces of the American state, as well as the elite knowledge networks, which they'd helped to generate, particularly around the Ford Foundation, for example. The argument is that the American century was built on violence and ideas, but those two factors are not binary opposites. There is such a thing, I would argue, as violent ideas as a concept. Humanitarian intervention has exhibited huge amounts of violence where it has been practiced. Democracy promotion has been accompanied by coercive regime change, which we ourselves know, even in your young lives period, in the last 20 or so years, you have seen how democracy promotion has been, if you like, weaponized in various ways. The responsibility to protect, and that concept is a gross distortion of an African Union idea of responsible sovereignty, but weaponized in places like Libya and other places as well. And in addition to that, in addition to those violent ideas, there is also the fact that consent of the peoples is not only argumentative persuasion, but it also offers people a stake in the status quo or the promised new settlement. That is, it's a system of material incentives. So when big American organizations and companies and foundations and think tanks and universities and so on go into a foreign country, they are not only persuading people through argument, they're actually offering material incentives which enable life, which enable careers, which enable research, which enable university programs and chairs and departments and so on. They enable careers. That is what an elite knowledge network does. It's a system not only of knowledge production, dissemination and mobilization, but it's a system of material incentives too. Aid from a rich state is a part of the system of the engineering of consent in other places and so on. So when we look at Gramsci, I would like to kind of combine Gramsci and post-colonial theory critiques of liberalism, that there are racial and hierarchical practices embedded within liberalism, which are but are embedded as technical and practical within that particular ideology. And that ideology parades as ideologically wedded to equality, but actually they work with the system of inequality as it is. They take the hierarchies for granted, and they do some things tinkering at the edges of that, as Maribel Moray's studies of Carnegie Corporation and the American Dilemma have shown, that in effect they perpetuate racial, class, gender, and other hierarchies. They take for granted, they work with their technocratic means with those existing hierarchies, and they modify them slightly to manage dissent and discontent, to manage the forms of change which they would desire against more radical change, which is actually just in the wings. That is, they contrast themselves, therefore, to much more radical or revolutionary nationalisms in the global South, and they try to ward off those, much as they developed in the 19th century and early 20th century in the United States, not only in themselves as a kind of new liberal progressive force, but also against alternative ideas, anarchism, socialism, unionism, and radical ideologies, which had a very different vision of what a modern America ought to look like. A different class in charge of those kinds of visions, different racial groups in charge of those kinds of divisions. And they operate in the same way as liberals on a global stage, perpetuating hierarchy and inequality and so on, and managing global change in ways in which are congenial to their own elite interests. So that is why I would argue that just 2 years ago, around this kind of time, the worldwide protests had broken out about George Floyd and racist police violence, and corporations were lining up, bandwagoning, rebranding themselves as anti-slavery, anti-racist, decolonizers, and so on. But where are they? Where are they now? That liberal movement is wafer thin. It is very, very superficial. It is very quick to jump onto certain kinds of bandwagons, but also to manage those bandwagons in order to kind of take it back to what they would like is the old kind of status quo. They're not managing to do that, but they have managed to ride that wave. And the same thing you could say, if you like, with the decolonizing, the academy, decolonizing IR, decolonizing universities and knowledge and societies and so on, and sort of various kinds of global South voices challenging convention and so on. Even during this war itself, African diplomats putting forward a very different idea about national sovereignty and border warfare and territorial redivisions and renegotiations and so on and so forth. But they're not the ones which are able to justify exactly what the West would like in regard to the Ukraine, but they are pushed to one side. And this is all to say two things. One is that knowledge doesn't just exist by itself. It exists in a combat. It exists in theoretical combat and exists in political combat, in real world politics itself. So I would argue that this is not liberal hypocrisy. Liberal hypocrisy is something bad people may do from time to time, which they know they are doing. I don't think this is hypocrisy at all in the main. I think this is an expression of the ideological and institutional embeddedness of core concepts in liberalism and in the liberal international order. This is what it does. This is how it thinks. This is how it is. And it's very core, if you like, being. And we can see that with the work of Amitav Acharya. We can see that the work with various people who've looked at NATO, and particularly Article 6, which is a defense of colonialism. We've seen how the Marshall Plan, paraded as this kind of massive benevolent force in post-war politics, and how much it relied on Africa and the restoration of Europe's African colonies and colonial ties in order to resurrect Western Europe. That it was a colonial project, along with NATO as well. We've seen with the Fulton speech and the kind of analysis of it done by Sergian Vucetich and many others, how heavily racialized and Anglo-Saxonist it actually was at its core. That even at the end of the Second World War, which had a Nazi race war ideology behind it, that when you've defeated a racial ideology is reimagined in Anglo-Saxonist forms as different from racial Nazi ideology and a more progressive ideology, which is sort of increasingly culturalized as time goes on. And we can see that with so-called ABCANs, the American, British, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealander forces, and the interoperability of their militaries since the Second World War itself. We see it in the Anglosphere and in the Five Eyes programs and so on. There is no liberal dilemma here. There is no dilemma or gap between their professed liberal desires for equality and opportunity and peace and so on, and the actual behavior, the activities. There is no dilemma. There's no gap. This is what the liberal international order is underpinned by. It's an expression of the entire system of power and of violence, the underpinning of the system with violent ideas. So I think it's really important then to see that there are theoretical ways which we need to understand, better understand the role of knowledge and knowledge power, and then critique the existing ways of thinking about it and locate our, so if you like, theoretical positions in the contestation within the academy of knowledge power itself. And I think then you can then begin to sort of argue against it in a much more effective way with those who take for granted the kind of liberalism as a progressive force based on ideas, progressive ideas, etc., and through a free market of ideas in some sort of liberal system. And I think it's really very important to do that, and that's why I included that theoretical section in this particular essay. But I know also we want to apply this set of ideas and so on to the current global crisis, and particularly the elite knowledge networks at war and violence today. Before I just go into that, I want to just say, bear in mind a few points. And the first one is that knowledge power works in a variety of loosely networked ways. But this is a process of elite knowledge network building, building consensus and elite unity, flooding the free market of ideas with knowledge products, experts, intellectuals, institutions, and outlets. This is the struggle for hegemony of elite ideas in competition with other ideas to prevent the formation of coherent alternative ideas and forces. You will remember Nikos Palansas arguing that the role of the ruling class state is to organize the ruling class, but also to disorganize the working class. And Gramsci's argument is that the engineering of consent isn't just one positive activity for the elite, but it also is a way of marginalizing the opposition. It's a war of ideational position on a permanent basis, which is intensified at crisis periods and at wars. So in that context, in the context of knowledge as a struggle for power, and the struggle for knowledge is a competitive struggle itself, and that elites are fully aware and prepared for that combat, what we can see then in the context, the current context, is that we have large numbers of people in the global south, in the global majority, and in the global north as well, many publications, many academics, including John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walton, former officials of the American state itself. We have people in the European Parliament like Claire Daly. We have global South thinkers and practitioners, politicians like Walden Bello of the Philippines, Vijay Prashad, the people who are doing the Rhodes Initiative in Pakistan, heroically against the militarized knowledge in those universities and academies. We have people like Siddharth Viratharajan in New Delhi, who's written his 10 theses on the Ukraine war article, and so on, founder and editor of The Wire. We have lots of different knowledges, lots of different competing voices, all in this kind of, if you like, this cauldron of debate and discussion and argument and so on. And that's why these knowledge forces, elite knowledge forces, have to be so active and so busy and so well funded in order to get anywhere. And when you see the opposition with far less funding, no real full access to the big media platforms, their voices pushed to the margins, never on the main news bulletins, never on the main kind of debates in parliaments and so on, but yet still so powerful. You see that knowledge warfare is a kind of is combat. It is killer knowledge. They are willing to, if you like, engage in this full-scale mobilizations because they know that actually a large numbers of the portion of the population of the world are not happy with the way the world works, and their life pushes them in a direction to dissent, to struggle against the status quo, and to think different kinds of thoughts and think about alternatives and so on. And the idea here is effectively to try to combat those kind of alternative voices, dissenting voices, and that kind of thing. And that's really very important to kind of bear in mind. So in this context then, the big elite knowledge networks and their funders, they have knowledge production strategies. Their foundation trustees and networks of referees, the government agency representatives that they constantly consult, the basic research that they put forward, the investment in research projects and scholars and university teaching research programs, postdocs, PhDs, research fellows, exchange programs, the knowledge forums that they set up where they bring knowledge producers and experts through seminars and conferences and policy forums together with practitioners, the public opinion forming activities that they carry out, the relationships they forge with the media, etc., the track 2 informal diplomacy, and even track 1 formal diplomacy that they carry out. That this is, if you like, a comprehensive, full spectrum knowledge power system that we are dealing with here. And that's a glimpse into that empirically is what I want to go on to now in the last 10 minutes or so of my 10, 12 minutes of my presentation, if you would be, please, a little bit patient with me as well. I've seen the message that Natália has kindly sent, but I know you want to know the really fascinating new material which I've just sort of prepared for this particular lecture. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I decided to pinpoint just one of the hundreds of foundations that operate in the United States, with a handful which are very powerful indeed. But I thought I'd just look at this one and let's see what it did. And what we find between 2014, the Crimea crisis, and 2021, the Carnegie Corporation alone contributed grants, money, on Russia-related topics, on Russian studies, on research on Russia, on exchange programs with Russia, dialogues with Russia. They donated $51 million to the American Academy alone. That's just one foundation. This went to the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., to the George Washington University, to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, to Columbia University, to Tufts, to the Rand Corporation. Around $6.6 million went to programs called Russia and the West, which were funded largely in Britain, in London, at the European Leadership Network, as well as at St. Antony's College, Oxford, as well, at the Oxford University. And the European Leadership Network, for example, was also funded to the tune of many hundreds of thousands of pounds and dollars by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, by NATO, the Rockefeller Foundation, and others as well. The Carnegie Corporation also funded a large amount, about $7 million, went to Track 2 diplomacy and dialogues. That is, scholars and other experts and practitioners in America bringing Russians over or going to Russia in order to dialogue with them, to build some sort of consensus, to build allies and partnerships, etc., elite knowledge networks, circulations of ideas, people, funds, and money, and so on. They also spend many hundreds of thousands of dollars building media and national security scholar linkages, media and scholar linkages on Russian issues, for example, at different universities. So Harvard, Georgia Tech, and the Woodrow Wilson Center, for example, received over $3 million to build these scholar and media linkages in regard to Russian issues. Military-to-military dialogue between Russia and the United States also. The Ukraine conflict alone got hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if you like, effectively what this network, this vast number of people were able to do with just that $51 million was produce dozens of books and papers, reports, conferences, seminars, media and kind of publishing programs, public meeting programs, teaching programs and exchange programs, and so on. That is to say, just one foundation was able to achieve a vast amount. And this is all publicly available information from their annual reports, which anyone can see, you can go online and find that information. All I did was spend a bit of time going through those one by one. But as I said, they also funded to some extent the Rand Corporation. Rand is actually an official government, US government research agency, but it also does a lot of study. It makes policy shifts. It does to Track 1 and Track 2 diplomacy. They have, if you want to really interested, look at their blog, which has this massive media outreach program. So the articles that they produce, they understand that they're not acting just as a kind of group of advisors to policymakers, but in the kind of overall media and knowledge complexes in the United States and outside the United States as well. And they have this vast media outreach program. So they do these Rand year-in reviews. So, for example, as soon as the Crimean crisis in 2014, 2015 had broken out, the Rand experts were already becoming more and more expert on Russian military doctrine and capabilities, how America and NATO can reinforce deterrence in Central Europe, at the same time as avoiding inadvertent escalation. They were running war games and tabletop exercises for government and military officials, communicating the results to NATO, to the army and air forces and leadership, senior leadership across Europe, and that this had a direct influence on spurring the first update of American contingency planning for armed conflict in Russia since the end of the Cold War, and strengthening America's military posture. As I said, they war-gamed possible Russian aggression in the Baltic states. They exposed so-called alarming vulnerabilities. They led American policymakers to increase troop presences. They shaped regional responses and helped NATO policy on countering Russian aggression. Iran team went to Ukraine to reform its security sectors, police, military, intelligence, border control, cybersecurity, etc., and RAND led a large number of Ukraine government reforms at that particular time as well. They also studied how civilian resistance in Ukraine might develop and look like, and how it may be able to combat any future Russian invasion, and how it would require significant international support, and that asymmetric warfare would be the kind of way to go, rather than sort of very heavy weapon systems and missile systems, but asymmetric warfare by civilian resistance, and that how this has worked quite well in Ukraine since the invasion by Russia in February 2022, and that they are rolling the concept out to Taiwan. And so in effect, what we've got here, if you like, is a RAND corporation, a government body, which also has private funding, but which is actually studying and then having influence, if you like, through various concepts on the Ukraine crisis itself. I would direct you also to this one very, very interesting report from the RAND Corporation in 2019 called Extending Russia, Competing from Advantageous Ground. And this report examines a range of means to extend Russia, to stress Russia's military and economy and regime credibility at home and abroad, make Russia compete with America in domains where the US has a competitive advantage, causing Russia to overextend itself militarily or economically, or causing the region, the other countries, to lose domestic and or international prestige and influence. And in effect, what their aim was to try to, in effect, goad Russia to act in particular ways, which would make them compete with the United States in areas where the US had superiority, which would then end up weakening regime credibility, regime strength, and tying up Russia, if you like, in areas where the US was already well protected. So this was reduce energy exports, reduce Russian energy exports, hinder pipeline development, increase energy production in the United States and export it, put sanctions on Russia, enhance Russia's brain drain, provide lethal aid to Ukraine, promote regime change in Belarus, exploit tensions in the Caucasus, in Moldova and Central Asia, back Syrian rebels more to attack Russian forces, etc. That is to say that this was the kind of concept and ideas and so on in part of the thinking about American power after the Crimean crisis of 2014. And in Ukraine, the government has spent $600 million in aiding Ukraine since that particular crisis, with the aim, as it says, to bleed Russia and to overextend it. But at the same time, worrying that, quote, Russia might respond by offensives and seizing more Ukrainian territory, which would be a big setback for the US and, as an afterthought, as a big setback to the Ukraine as well. But also saying that the US have done this before with SDI and the Star Wars initiative in the 1980s, and in regard to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s as well, and that this was important in order to kind of continue that sort of process. So what we've had is kind of big knowledge production. We also knowledge mobilized for use in the US and NATO and in Europe and in Ukraine, etc. But in addition to that, there's also a Ukraine lobby in the United States, in Washington, D.C. A very interesting recent report by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft has looked at the FARA filings of this, and they've shown that the Ukraine lobby in Washington, D.C. sent over 10,000 messages or meetings, invitations in 2021, far more than the Saudi lobby or any other lobby in the United States at that particular time. And that most of this was going to the Congress, but also to two think tanks, which are hardline, the Atlantic Council and to the Heritage Foundation, which are much more hardline and hawkish on Russia and Ukraine and weapons and so on. But also to try to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and also to increase pressure for Russian sanctions. And that the Atlantic Council itself had received money from a Ukrainian oligarch through his Viktor Pinchuk Foundation, someone who sits on the board of the Atlantic Council itself, and that the Pinchuk Foundation is linked very well with the Brookings, the Blair Faith Foundation, the Clinton Global Institute, and many others. The Atlantic Council, as you know, is funded by a very large number of other organizations as well, including dozens of foreign governments. Also, the Burisma gas company in the Ukraine has been giving it 100,000 per annum for 3 years from 2016 to 2019, and that it also received $1 million from the British government and from Facebook, another $1 million from the Rockefeller Foundation, but also funds from the State Department, from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and other arms firms, as well as from NATO, something in the region of 100,000 to 250,000 also. And what we can see there again is that the mobilization of political forces, backed up by the kind of knowledge that they generate in a variety of kind of think tanks, Heritage, Atlantic Council, Carnegie, and the universities they fund, and so on. And very briefly, to go into the National Endowment for Democracy, from 2014, with the Crimean crisis, to 2022, the National Endowment for Democracy spent and invested $22 million in Ukraine alone. And Ukraine is the fourth largest NED grant program in the world. And it's been active there since the 1980s in civil society building. So what they've been doing is training students and leaders, activists, doing scholarly exchanges, civic education, documenting human rights violations and so on, promoting market economy, and promoting a kind of line of particular way of seeing what Russia is. Russia as a force in Europe, Russia as a force in general, as a source of aggression in Ukraine, and so on. And then finally, empirically, I just want to look at the concept of media bias. It's a very interesting article in the Columbia Journalism Review in March 2022. You can look at, called "The Biases in Coverage of the War in Ukraine." And we've already seen the racialized coverage, and this article does a very good job in highlighting that further. It shows how the media, broadly speaking, has portrayed the conflict in Ukraine as something which is different from other conflicts anywhere else in the world. These are European people, these are civilized, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, not Iraqis or Syrians or any other, and these are, if you like, acceptable, civilized people. They're people you can empathize with, not like the rest of them, and therefore there's a completely different attitude towards it. And this, of course, has caused a huge amount of upset across the world, in the global south, the Middle East, and many other parts of the world as well, and a lot of dissent and opposition to it. And the volume of coverage which has been given to the Ukraine crisis dwarfs all other wars in the global south, many of which have had far greater damage and casualties. That is not to underestimate or to deny the suffering of Ukrainian people. It is just to say how differentially this conflict has been treated compared with so many others. And that it repeats, if you like, the myth of the war in Europe as an aberration, despite historical evidence that this is a kind of, if you like, sort of the long peace has been broken. This continuous long peace since 1945 has been broken, this myth and so on, which is the kind of Eurocentric, whereas actually there have been many, many wars in the world. Many, many millions of bodies have piled up, particularly in the third world, in the global south, which are discounted by this whole myth of the long peace and so on. But it repeats that Eurocentric kind of mythology. And if you like, the kind of almost complete and utter denunciation of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, but never of that type when it came to the United States and Iraq or Libya or elsewhere. And then, of course, the production of the talking heads on the media from the national security establishment, from defense firms and so on. But they're presented as experts, but actually they're not just commentators, they're actors. They are actors in the political process of making war in regard to Ukraine. They have their own worldview. They promote militaristic strategies and policies, no-fly zones, for example, and so on. They promote escalation under the cover of humanitarianism rather than stating it openly as an act of war. So this just kind of gives you an idea, if you like, how the different kind of parts of this knowledge networks, that they are kind of very well, either overtly or covertly or accidentally, they actually are integrated with each other. There's a kind of vertical integration from the production of knowledge, if you like a kind of oil reserves, and then the refining of it, the kind of policy entrepreneurs who operationalize it, the people who then package it and promote it in the media and among policymakers who carry out track-to diplomacy and so on. This is a dense elite knowledge network which has its kind of knowledge basis, its governmental, as well as its kind of media and public opinion kind of basis. So I would argue that knowledge power, to conclude, that knowledge power is an immense resource. Knowledge is not soft power. It is lethal, and it is for war. The US is a global knowledge empire, as is its liberal international order and knowledge empire. And that knowledge networks are a vital resource in warfare, in crisis, and in ordering and reordering in a changing world, both at home and abroad. But they are subject to this crisis of authority, which means they are becoming more and more coercive, and as more and more dissent, resistance, and alternatives arise. And we can see that from post-colonialism, from the left more broadly, even realist analysts on the right, from new think tanks like Quincy, the Center for International Policy, the Center for National Interest, from others like Cato and others, from the splits within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party itself, between Trumpists and others, the media wars which are going on between Fox News and CNN and others like it, the kind of schisms you could see in social media, etc., as well as global South voices and so on and so forth, and the critiques that come from that. So, as you can see, it's a vast subject. And as I was saying to Natália before we started this lecture, just before we started, we need a deconstructing global knowledge research network. And I would urge all those who are interested, who are listening to this, if you're interested in this, I'll be very happy to speak with you to try to see what we can do as a kind of group of scholars with our research to try to promote that research network and to kind of have our say in this kind of in this sort of a combat and struggle for over ideas, because we can have an influence and we can see how knowledge is highly valued and can be so influential and consequential as well. So thank you very much for your patience. I've gone over a bit longer than I think you had probably hoped, but I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions from you, the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parmar. It was really great. I think it was perfect timing. And we have already some of questions. One of them, it was from Rodrigo Amaral, who is also lecturer in international relations, and it's also a member of GECI. And he congratulates you and says that it was a brilliant and very empowering lecture. And he sent some questions. The first of all, he asked about the rationality of the process of developing knowledge networks as a mechanism for promoting hegemonic power. He said, you particularly mentioned the expression of these networks in the USA from the 20th century onwards, and it's possible to trace more precisely the origins of this as a formal strategic practice. I think it's more to complement the question you started. The second question is about how we can see or if there is a differences in the ideological spectrum in US foreign policy. You started to talk a little about at the end. He said, could we say that liberal internationalism would be the consensual product among the different actors of this intellectual elite network? To what extent is this in fact homogeneous? And a third question, if it's possible, he said, if possible, could you tell us a little about the methodological process used to collect data on these intellectual elite networks? I think he was asking more in general, not only about the data you collected for this presentation. Let me see if we can get one more question. We have another question about Ukraine. Relating to Ukraine war, is it correct to apply Gramsci theory over hegemony to let me just 1 moment. How good is to use Gramsci theory over hegemony to understand criticism about Russia and how this is in part to achieve dominance also in Russia over their neighbors? How good it would be. I think we have enough questions, and I organize a next session after it. What do you think?
Okay, thank you very much to Rodrigo for his questions and to others as well. I'm happy to try to deal with them as much as I possibly can. In terms of the rationality of knowledge production, its 20th century, early 20th century roots and as a strategic practice, I think is really very important. So I think the whole concept of scientific giving arose in the early part of the 20th century, particularly with the Rockefeller Foundation and by somebody called Frederick Gates, who was an advisor to John D. Rockefeller, who was getting large amounts of individual demands for money for various projects and so on. And Gates put it on, if you like, a rigorous scientific, systematic basis, a bureaucratic basis of saying that what is the aim of scientific philanthropy in an age of the rise of social science? It wasn't just charitable handouts, it was actually a strategic mission to reshape society, to promote those kinds of forces which would be modernizing America and American government, American society, and American academy, and so on, American practices in light of, if you like, capitalist modernization, or liberal capitalist modernization, as opposed to socialist modernization or any other kind. So yes, it was a self-conscious development, and you can see the papers, within those kind of archives, and many people have published them, those kinds of from those archives as well. And the second one was that, is there a difference in the ideological spectrum in American foreign policy, or is there a kind of consensus around liberal internationalism? And I think that's a really great question, and I think that consensus is still powerful, but it has been breached more and more over time, and I would say in a number of different ways. The first one was when you go back to the election of 2020, for example, both candidates, Trump and Biden, stood on a platform of ending forever wars. That is the first time that both candidates have stood on any kind of platform of that type. That is to say, they were against the whole idea of massive American direct military interventions and sort of commitments and so on. And their aim was to invent that. So that is to say, public support, broad public support from foreign military interventions is very weak. So there's more and more dissensus around that. Secondly, that's reflected in the political parties. So you got kind of those who are opposed to that. Often they're called isolationists, wrongly, but these are people who say, well, no, the US should focus far more on attention on its own issues and problems at home and stay out of interference in other countries. That is not to say that it should not be engaged with international organizations like the UN and so on, multilaterally, but it should not be out there up front and center, leading the way in the way it has done and got into so much kinds of trouble. And those tendencies have become strong in both main political parties. You can see that in the mass media, particularly with Fox News and so on as well, and CNN and others. You can also see it in the think tank landscape. So when I talk about Heritage and the Council on Foreign Relations and Brookings and groupings of that type, they remain quite significantly in that kind of liberal consensus. But even they say, maybe we have gone too far. Maybe we have pushed it too aggressively, that the liberal agenda has created this kind of trouble, and we are getting blowback from the rest of the world and from our own people as a result of it. That's why these political parties are fighting elections on this kind of a platform. So even liberal internationalist think tanks are also having to shift and change from their kind of hyper positions that they occupied before. And then, of course, you got new think tanks like the Quincy, and then the old ones like Cato, and so on and so forth. So there is far more debate. And look at the academy itself. Now, a lot of people have been silenced on the Ukraine question, but there's a lot of people who are still speaking out about it and so on and getting vilified. John Mearsheimer himself, as a realist, has faced massive attacks, but he's used to it. He wrote the book on the Israel lobby and so on, way about 20 years ago, etc. as well. So did Steve Walt. But that is to say, people in even prestigious positions are dissenting against the kind of dominant sorts of views. So I think there is that schism, and that is inside the United States, and it's also reflected in the world. You can't shut up the whole of the rest of the world anymore. They have their own media, they have their own think tanks, they've got their own universities, they've got their own scholars, and so on, and they are speaking, and so on, and they're joining those kinds of voices. So I would say there's far less of a powerful consensus, and that's part of the crisis of legitimacy of the liberal international system and of American hegemony at the core of it. They have hyper-globalized, and that hyper-globalization has led to certain kinds of activities which have now undermined legitimacy within the most societies, especially including the leading nations themselves. Methodology of data collection, well, I looked at a lot of historical archives, as you all probably know, in the United States. I applied a variety of theories. I tried to test different theoretical frames. I developed what each theory, rival theory, would expect to find in what these organizations are claiming to do. And then I compared what I found with what these theories claimed, and then I kind of came up with my findings and so on, and claimed that Gramscian theory is the best way of explaining these outcomes. In the latest group, I basically didn't go in. I looked at the archives online of the annual reports, the grant programs, and how much money goes to whom and for what purpose, etc. Just a lot of digging through thousands of pages of that kind of stuff, applying the same kind of thing. Nothing really revolutionary, unusual there. The final thing is Gramsci any good in explaining what Russia is doing in Ukraine? I think it is. Gramsci was against imperial war. He was against colonial war. He was against aggression. He did not believe that one country had the right to attack another country. His argument was that there are too many countries, colonial countries, imperial countries, which force themselves on other parts of the world when they're not wanted, and that he was on the side of the oppressed and those who are fighting for national liberation. He spoke for the southern Italians against the northern Italians. He spoke for the colonial peoples who are being killed and starved, who are being blinded, and who are being mobilized in World War I in a colonial war, in imperial war. His theory, I think, is a theory for justice. It's a theory for ordinary people to be empowered, and against elites who would wage wars, who are allied with big oligarchs who have robbed that country blind for the last 25 to 30 years with the connivance of the West, of London, Washington, D.C., of Berlin and Paris, and they've been visited by all the great and the good. Putin has received every major leader of the Western world when he was number one, was in the good books. Tony Blair went there, everybody went there, and so on and so forth. I outrightly, and Gramsci would condemn this invasion, this attack, and the barbaric character of that warfare being fought there. It is part of the hegemonic project, a violent hegemonic project with violent ideas of an oligarchy which runs Russia and is to be condemned. However, I can see also how the opposition to it is also aggressive. The Rand report I was talking about Machiavelli couldn't have written it himself. Have a look at it, 2019, extending Russia. Now, of course, the American knowledge machine produces thousands and thousands of scenarios and reports and so on. But Rand is not just a random organization. It's part of the heart of the machinery of knowledge production for national security. It also has a huge outreach program, which is linked with all sorts of other universities, university scholars, media, etc., etc. It's a part of the production of consensus about this particular war as well. So yes, I'd say Gramsci is the ideal scholar and revolutionary thinker to apply to this, and I think he would condemn this kind of barbaric war that Russia is waging. But I think he would also look at the hegemonic projects of the West, of the United States, of NATO, and so on, and look at the colonial character of NATO as well. And if you look at Article 6 of NATO, you will see that it contains a clause which says that any attack on France's Algerian and other African colonies north of the Tropic of Cancer would apply to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, that anybody who attacks those colonial possessions would be in breach of NATO, and therefore all the NATO countries would fight in defense of France in Algeria. So I would condemn colonialism and neo-colonialism and imperialism and this warfare, military violence, wherever it occurs in this kind of way, as a part of the hegemonic projects of Russian elites and of other elites. Thank you.
Thank you, Parmar. I have two more questions here. One is about the hegemonic power, and the other is the opposite, about the counter-hegemony. One is a question you about how do you see the intersection of the hegemonic power with the UN system, and the other one is asking about what is more difficult, producing anti-elitist knowledge, to produce this anti-elitist knowledge, or to build networks that can transport and transfer such knowledge. So two opposite questions.
Fantastic, brilliant. I love the second question in particular, which was where I kind of sort of ended. But the first one, the hegemony in the UN system. That's a really very, very good question, actually. I was actually thinking about it for a presentation I'm going to give in sometime in the future, perhaps next year. And I think the UN system, it's very difficult to say one thing but exactly about that and capture the entire UN system, because the UN system is many things, actually. Of course, on one hand, it is the production of the two or the major powers, particularly the United States, Britain, and also the Soviet Union after the Second World War, and has embedded within it great power, kind of, if you like, concentrated power. So the Security Council, for example, is a part of that, and that cements their veto power and effectively what that organization can actually do in practice in so many different ways, which conflict it's going to go into, where it thinks a violation has taken place, and the veto that Russia exercises or the US exercises over various many things means that the great powers are embedded in that. So it is a hegemonic institution in a number of ways for the great powers in the world. At the same time, the General Assembly is also a great forum, because the General Assembly, obviously early on in the 1940s and early 50s, before the newly independent countries took their seats in the United Nations General Assembly, it was basically a Western-dominated body. But by the 1950s and 1960s, more and more Asian and African and other states entered it as sovereign representatives of their countries. And that chamber then changed very radically. So what it became was, if you look at Bandung Conference in 1955 in Indonesia, the first conference of non-white powers from around the world, excluded the white countries from it completely. It was an expression of the rise of Ghana, the rise of India, the rise of many other countries around the world, and so on, and saying, we are here, we have arrived on the world stage, and we are going to do something to shape it. And that grouping then led on to the non-aligned movement in 1961 in Belgrade, which also included China, but also Yugoslavia, for example. And that also then led to the G77. The G77 was also an alliance with Latin American countries, with the Afro-Asian countries as well, which became a bloc within the United Nations General Assembly. And there was that group which promoted the new international economic order in the 1970s, which was a counter-hegemonic movement to redistribute institutional wealth, income, and power in the global forum and in the global kind of North-South relations. So I think the United Nations in that context can be also a body which can embody a counter-hegemonic strategies and alternatives as well. And that is why the UN is less and less used by the big powers, because they can't get their own way in the General Assembly in particular. And then the fact you have these non-permanent members of the Security Council, there's 10 of them. So there's 15 in the Security Council, 10 of them are kind of rotational. They can have a big influence. And so they're the ones in 2003 who said the US is not going to war, not passing a resolution in the UN to go to war in Iraq. They prevented it from happening. So I would argue that the UN, and then the UN has many agencies like UNCTAD, for example, trade and development, but also UNESCO, which is kind of much more kind of liberal and open to dissenting voices and so on. And the World Health Organization, for example, which also kind of lobbies on behalf of some global South states too, but also is very dominated in various ways. That is to say, wherever there are contending forces, there will be struggles for influence, for power. There will be blocks of countries which will form, which have formed, and which then have developed new agendas and so on, and then fight for their positions. So in the WTO as well, for example, the BRICS, we tend to dismiss the BRICS, we tend to dismiss the Global South as of no consequence in the world. But believe you me, the powers that be do not dismiss them. They develop all sorts of strategies to combat, to manage, to integrate, co-opt, to sort of, if you like, defang, domesticate them, and so on. So I would argue that the UN system, it comes out of the colonial system and so on, but it is also more than that. And of course, the people who pay the budget, the US, which pays, I don't know, 35, 40% of it, threatens to leave one agency or another agency. For example, recently under Trump, they left the UN Human Rights Council, and now under Biden, they've rejoined it. And the UN Human Rights Council, in the wake of George Floyd and so on, is actually looking at the race situation and police violence across the world, particularly including the United States, and to investigate it and report on it, and to ask for reforms in the American police forces' attitude towards the use of violence against members of racial minorities. So I'd say the UN is a very, very kind of complex, big system. And it has many openings and forums, and I think it can be very useful. So to go to the other question, counter-hegemony and how to produce counter-hegemonic knowledge and knowledge networks. Well, I think it starts fundamentally from the premise that the system of world power, or the systems of world power, more or less are deeply unequal. They're unequal in the distribution of power within states and at the global levels, and they're unequal in this division of the rewards of income and wealth and political power too. In those conditions of great inequality, and especially when that inequality means that the people are being relatively immiserated at a greater level and more intensively, that is to say, their conditions of life are reduced and are decreasing beyond what they were led to believe they could expect. They question things. People ask questions about the American dream, for example. Middle class is shrinking in the United States. Graduates are finding it difficult to get jobs to pay their debts and so on and so forth. If people who went to school, went to university, passed their exams, developed great debts, are unhappy, the millennials, unhappy on so many different fronts, that when Gallup asks them, or YouGov asks them, do you like capitalism? Would you like socialism? Do you like communism? And 40%, 45% are saying yes, of millennials are saying yes, we prefer socialism to what is going on here. That tells you that the conditions of life themselves propel people in directions of dissent and so on. And when you live a life where you have a high chance of being killed or a high chance of being attacked by the police, where between the age of 18 and 25, if an African-American male, you've got a 25% chance of being in the incarceration or so-called criminal justice system, you have very powerful propellers telling you that the advert for America and where you live and how you live are two very different things. So one is the material basis of society generates dissent. Then you have the kind of scholars, intellectuals, people who think about the world and so on, who are, if you like, analyzing the world, looking at history, looking at the development of forces and so on, who then connect with others in the academy, outside the academy, in think tanks and so on, in small think tanks. But the big disadvantage is you will know it already. Carnegie Corporation alone can spend $51 million from 2014 to 2021. I'd like them to give me $51 million, and let's see what we could do in 7 years with $51 million to build counter-hegemonic networks. That's just one foundation. They're not going to do it. Of that I am certain. But what I'm saying to you is that despite all that money, if you were to look at MacArthur, Ford, Rockefeller, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and a dozen other foundations which are handing out hundreds of thousands, if not millions per annum, put them all together, then you haven't even talked about the American state yet and all its agencies and the 600 million they spent in Ukraine alone in 7 years. That is a massive machine to produce hegemony. And guess what? They're in a crisis of legitimacy. That is what makes it easier to set up counter-hegemonic networks, because the fundamental problem is so deep that even those within the hegemony are saying we need change. And that's the crisis of hegemony, is when it can't even do what it promises for the sort of people that it said it was going to look after. Middle-class people, right? They can say, poor people, it's your fault. But these are people who went to college and university and so on and so forth that they're talking about now. So I would say it's not easy to be an activist. It's not easy to be an organizer. It's not easy because you're producing knowledge in your time. You're then having to do all the other things. But what I would argue is that there are enough like-minded people in civil society, in academia, in other places. And I think the thing we need to do is to see that this is a political struggle. And it's not just a scholarly question. It's a political struggle. I've learned a lot about knowledge networks from the research I've been doing on the masters of the production of knowledge networks. And we don't have the resources, but what we have is a very large number of people who think in those kind of directions. And it's the struggle of those hearts and minds which is the object of the combat. And they spend so much money on that. They're spending tens of millions of pounds and dollars, but yet they are in crisis. So I think, I was saying to Natalia, I think we need a global knowledge research network. Scholars from Brazil, other parts of Latin America, from the United States, from Asia, from Africa, and so on and so forth. They are doing really good work, but I think what happens is, we think we are alone. We think we are very small and small minorities, but I don't think we are. I think there's a lot more, a hell of a lot more people going on and doing that. And I think the thing to do is to get organized. And that's why I think this global knowledge research network, which could ally itself with civil society institutions, with radical think tanks, and so on in global North and global South, and so on. And if you look at, for example, the Miami Institute for the social study of the social sciences that Maribel Morey runs, that is a kind of global majority sort of oriented knowledge production institution. It aims to be a research institute. You look at a whole range of number of different things. The Rhodes Initiative in Pakistan, which is trying to kind of develop new forms of knowledge to take on hegemonic power and so on, and particularly militarized knowledge. And there are many others as well. So in the United States, for example, the Security Policy Reform Institute that Stephen Semler runs, the Center for International Policy, which has been going since the 1970s, and Quincy Institute, which has been going since about 2020 or thereabouts. I went to their founding conference in February 2020, for example, and so on as well. So I think it is a question of pulling together resources that we currently have, and I think that would be what I would suggest. So counter-hegemonic knowledge is hard. everything is hard. That's because it's important. So I say we get unified and organized to do what we want to do better.
Thank you very much, Parmar. I was listening to you and thinking and that here in Brazil during the war, we had we could almost never listen and have access to counter-hegemonic voices about the war, about the Ukraine war. There was a large hegemonic discussion that it was almost totally present in the media discussions, even sometimes in some elite discussions. And I was thinking how the war is a very powerful moment for these knowledge networks and transnational knowledge networks. And I also remember that I've read some articles in American magazines last month that they were discussing almost delighted about the Ukraine war because they were feeling a crisis moment, and now there was an opportunity to pave the way for a new order that would isolate Russia and maybe isolate also China. And so I think I would like to hear a little more about how do you see these discussions among these knowledge networks.
Well, you're absolutely right, Natália. The situation here was wall to wall, 24 hours a day, and I've never seen anything like it. There was like a kind of total mobilization. If you look at every institution, practically, I'm not just talking about knowledge institutions, political institutions, corporations, civil organizations, universities, sporting organizations, cultural organizations, ban Russian athletes from this, do this, do this, do this, and then all the sanctions and everything else and so on. And for that moment, if you like, it's like the tonic of a war. When you find yourself besieged at home and abroad, and you are just mired in a crisis of legitimacy, of who are you, and how have you created this mess in which we live at home and abroad, then a foreign war is actually a very good thing, because suddenly somebody else is to blame for something or other, and they take the heat off you. I'm reading this fantastic book by Jacques Pauwels. I don't know if that's his name. He's a French Canadian. It's called The Great Class War. It's about the First World War. And his argument there, I mean, I've been reading it because I have felt in the last few years that domestic crises are building so much towards this sort of looking at the external as some sort of threat and so on, and to unify countries around. And you see the build up to World War I in very many different ways, kind of these domestic crises of legitimacy, revolutionary socialism, democracy, women's rights, Irish home rule, anti-colonialism, and so on. Massive forces challenging the status quo. So yes, as soon as this came along, then the kind of, if you like, the whole sort of army, the whole arsenal of power, of every instrument of power went into action, almost as if, oh, fantastic, this has happened. Now we can kind of be united. We're together. Oh yeah, the EU is asking for like a separate army. They're not talking about that anymore. They wanted Germany to do a lot more. Germany says, yeah, we'll be there with some difficulties. They were talking about, sort of China, Russia and China and so on. Everybody was talking about increasing degrees of disunity, and this sort of unified. However, the problem is that you got within the hegemonic system, dissenting voices now coming to the fore. If you're going to spend 40 billion American dollars on military and other aid to Ukraine, and you can vote that without hardly a debate, what about all the people in America who are getting nothing? People have been saying, get rid of the filibuster. We need this investment, that investment, and so on. They are asking questions. How come you can spend as much as you like on this when you are not paying attention to our plight itself? Then you got the New York Times, one of the cheerleaders for war, just last week in various editorial board or whatever, saying, I'm not sure we can actually carry on at this level of expenditure with Ukraine. Already stepping back and questioning, are we going too far? Because Russia stabilized its positions. Early days was euphoric, oh, they're getting defeated and so on. Last week or so, it's been, oh, actually their positions in various parts of Ukraine have become consolidated and more powerful and so on. So that is to say that the war, I think, operated as a kind of temporary sort of, maybe euphoria is the wrong word, but certainly a sort of sense of relief that the democracies could get together. The world was really only divided into two types, democracies and autocracies. Autocracies wage unjust, barbaric wars. Democracies protect. That enabled that kind of view. It enabled them to forget Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and many other places and so on. It enabled them to just forget. If somebody said that, they would just say, well, this is whataboutism. This is just whataboutism. You're not allowed to talk about that because this is new. The world is now year zero. We start again. And actually life isn't like that. And the crisis, the underlying crises, are being shown that the sanctions are hitting Western European people and families. Food production, food prices, energy costs, energy prices are hitting ordinary people in a big way. Not just in Europe, but in North America, in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere. Meanwhile, the EU is still buying vast amounts, like billions of euros worth of gas and oil from Russia, the country that they say that they're trying to defeat and to cancel. There are so many problems, and the global South is not applying any sanctions, hardly at all. They said, we're not doing it. Why would we do it? What's this got to do with us? And so on. So, it hasn't just, it was a temporary fix, but I think all the different kind of splits and divisions and so on are coming to the fore more and more. And so I think, I think there's a kind of political economy of the war, but I think the overall kind of trajectories, longer term trajectories, seem to be kind of continuing as well. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Parmar. It was really great to have you with us today. Thank you very much for taking time for our discussion. And we had students and professors and other people who were watching us. And I think it was really perfect. It was really great to have you.
Well, thank you very much, because I wouldn't have written this lecture had you not invited me. And really, I mean, in a way, it's one of those things where I think as a scholar who's engaged with the world, we want to be able to say something knowledgeable about it as well. And that does require a little bit of research as well. But it's a pleasure to be able to sort of speak with you and to address some of the questions as well. So, but I'm serious about this Global Knowledge Research Network, and maybe Natália and I can speak a little bit more, and others who may be interested could join us as well. So thank you very much for this very kind invitation.